I recently came across the story of an Australian influencer named Caitlin Bailey who flew to the United States in order to undergo IVF and guarantee that her fourth child would be a girl. Now, flying to the United States in order to undergo IVF is not a cheap procedure, and the reason that she did it is because choosing the sex of your child is banned at IVF clinics in Australia. So naturally, this sparked a lot of outrage online because people saw it as her spending money to choose the gender of her child, which is something that isn't accessible to the average Australian person. Globally, this practice is becoming more common nowadays. This video is not actually about Caitlin Bailey. It's not about choosing the sex of your child. It's about power, privilege, and the uncomfortable question of where to draw the line when it comes to altering traits in human beings. Before I get started, here's a quick overview of a couple of biology terms that I'm going to use throughout the video. DNA is the instruction manual that humans, animals, plants, bacteria, some viruses use to do literally everything. It essentially forms a code made up of these 4 letters, which your body reads to understand what it needs to do. Genes are big chunks of DNA that are tied to a particular job or function. Genetic modification is the process of changing DNA code to get a specific trait that we want. Have you ever seen the movie Gattaca? It follows Vincent Freeman, who is a naturally birthed child in a world of designer babies. Parents in the world of Gattaca are able to totally optimize their children before they're born, giving them maximum stats in every category. Vincent faces systemic roadblocks in his life, as his natural born status makes him a second-class citizen compared to the designer babies of the world. But the designer babies face issues as well. Jerome battles with mental health as he struggles to live up to the expectations that were placed upon him being a designer baby. Now, obviously, it's just a science fiction movie, but reality is a lot closer to it than you might think. Prenatal screening allows scientists to check whether embryos might develop diseases or physical conditions before and during pregnancy, but the real magic is CRISPR, which allows us to actually cut and paste pieces of DNA within human cells. This technique and similar techniques have been used to create genetically modified organisms for years now. Scientists developed CRISPR by essentially stealing a pair of genetic scissors from some bacteria. They used them to chop up the DNA of invaders. We tweak them a little bit so that they only chop up the exact pieces of DNA that we want them to. We can even build little pieces of code in the lab and attach them to the scissors so we can replace whatever piece of a gene we don't like. And if that wasn't enough, a new technique known as CAST could allow us to remove and replace entire genes, not just little snippets. Well, that all sounds a bit scary. Why would we want to mess with DNA anyway? Well, CRISPR has already caused substantial change in our world. In 2024, a genetically modified banana called QCAV4 was approved for consumption in Australia. This particular banana is resistant to Panama disease, which was threatening to destroy global supply. We've also seen the development of tomatoes containing GABA. They're sold in Japan, and research indicates that they can lower blood pressure and decrease stress. Drought-tolerant maize strains help farmers in arid areas. And golden rice, which promises to solve vitamin A deficiency, which is a real problem in a lot of developing nations. Okay, yeah, maybe that one hasn't worked perfectly. In animals, scientists have used CRISPR to create sterile male mosquitoes with the intention of collapsing mosquito populations that carry diseases like Zika, dengue, and malaria. And there have even been developments in reviving extinct traits in endangered species to try and help them better survive, like woolly mammoth traits being added to Asian elephants. Using CRISPR in humans is a bit more complicated and has developed more slowly, but in 2023, Casgevy became the first CRISPR-based treatment approved in the USA and UK. People who suffer from beta thalassemia and sickle cell anemia often require daily medications, frequent blood transfusions, and even bone marrow transplants, as their bodies are unable to produce red blood cells correctly, which means they can't carry oxygen as effectively as a healthy person. Casgevy is a one-off treatment that relieves symptoms of these diseases seemingly forever. And just recently, the first ever personalized CRISPR treatment was used to seemingly help a baby named KJ who suffered from CPS1 deficiency. Usually this disease is treated by a liver transplant, but only half of children diagnosed live long enough to receive one. Scientists mapped KJ's DNA and identified one single letter of DNA code that was causing the disease. They gave him an infusion that used CRISPR technology to replace the dodgy A with a G, and now his medication dosage has been halved and he's no longer on a restrictive diet. What's the catch though? Gene editing technology has given us the power to revolutionize agriculture, conservation, disease treatment, but we can't put this power back. What is going to come next? And where will we stop? If choosing our child's sex is okay, what about their eye color or their hair color? Their height, intelligence, athleticism, attractiveness? Are we prepared for the consequences of developing this technology? If you spend any time learning about evolution, something that becomes immediately clear is that everything is a trade-off. Even traits that seem strictly beneficial always come at a cost. Tall people, for example, have higher rates of joint injury and heart problems. We've also identified some genes that seem to be associated with increased intelligence, but are also associated with higher rates of schizophrenia and autism. We may make a genetic change with the best intentions, but we can't know what effect it will have on a whole human until after we've done it, and this is not something to be taken lightly. Further, what if the cost is more abstract? What if increased intelligence leads to more narcissistic behaviors and less altruism? It's not easy to track these sorts of traits on an individual level, and by the time we recognize a societal change, it's probably too late. A central part of many religious and spiritual belief systems is that humans should be custodians of the natural world rather than trying to control it. Many anti-GMO groups have argued that editing genes is playing God, and it's not something that humans have a right to be doing. Now, regardless of whether you personally follow a religion or not, a large percentage of the world does, and genetically modifying humans will always create discomfort and unease within these sects. If we start trying to create enhanced humans, that messaging is guaranteed to incite anger and backlash across the world. To build on that idea, who will even have access to gene editing technology? Now, I deliberately didn't mention the cost of Casgevy earlier in the video. One treatment, one infusion, $2.2 million US. That's how much it costs to treat one patient with Casgevy. That is completely unrealistic for your average Western individual or Western family, and consider families in developing countries. Without subsidies, this treatment is absolutely inaccessible to 99% of the world. And Casgevy is a treatment for a debilitating chronic disease. There is no chance that governments or insurance companies will subsidize gene editing to improve attractiveness or intelligence or athleticism. This means that these options will only be available to the ultra-wealthy, which will exacerbate the already existing divide between the upper and middle and lower classes. One other point to think about that I don't think is immediately obvious is that it's extremely difficult to decide which traits are good and which traits are bad. Curing genetic diseases seems straightforward, but when combined with the aforementioned accessibility issues, it could lead to even more discrimination. To give a real-world example, prenatal screening has led to a reduction in babies born with Down syndrome, as parents are now able to tell very early in the pregnancy if their child will be born with Down syndrome, and they're given the option to terminate. Research out of Sweden indicates that this may have caused an increase in discrimination and judgment of parents and children with Down syndrome, as the condition is now viewed as preventable. But that's not fair at all on the child, who has no say in their upbringing, and it's not fair on the parent, who should not be forced to terminate a pregnancy if they don't want to. Even something like correcting vision is complicated because where would you correct it to? 20/20? Some people have better vision than that, so why wouldn't you go further? Is below average eyesight even a negative trait? A lot of people find glasses extremely attractive, and it's a key part of a lot of people's identity. And that's a common theme when trying to categorize traits as undesirable. Think about a simple trait that you might change about yourself if you were given the chance. Did you say a receding hairline? Well, Walton Goggins is considered one of the most attractive men in the world, not in spite of his hairline, but because of it. Maybe your front teeth are a bit too big? Amy Lou Wood is another extremely successful Hollywood actress who has been given enormous praise for her natural teeth. You want a different eye color? Are you going to tell me that one eye color is better than another? And that's the problem. People have different preferences. There's no such thing as an unattractive physical trait because everyone's into different things. And what's more, those preferences are constantly changing. Your preferences are probably completely different than they were 2 years ago. Now imagine an entire world of changing preferences. How can a single physical trait possibly be good or bad? Genes, on the other hand, don't work like that. You can't just reverse a CRISPR edit the way that I shave all of my hair off whenever I get sick of it. A genetic modification is permanent. And depending on how and when it's administered, it can be more than permanent. It can be passed down through generations indefinitely. So even if we all agree that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, the moment we make a change permanent, it becomes a political statement about what is desirable and what is undesirable. Most countries understand this and have put laws in place to restrict research involving genetic editing, but what do those laws look like? And how close are we really to designer babies and character customization? The legal framework around editing human genetics is not totally consistent. Somatic cell research is totally legal in the Western world, although it is subject to governmental oversight. Somatic cells are cells that won't get passed down to the next generation, so this means that research about gene editing in adults is generally considered okay, although any products produced are subject to strict oversight from regulatory bodies and governments. Germline cell editing is a different story though. Changes made to germline cells don't end with the life of the patient. They are passed down to any children that they might have, and their children, and their children, and their children. And this includes changes made to embryos. Modifying embryos is legal in the United Kingdom, European Union, and Australia, but exclusively for research purposes. And often a requirement of conducting research of this kind is that any embryo that is genetically modified must be destroyed within 14 days. And there are also blanket bans on attempting to create genetically modified babies. In the United States, federal funding cannot be used for any research that creates and destroys embryos, and the FDA currently can't approve any clinical trials involving genetic modifications that can be passed down through generations. But, in classic United States fashion, private research on embryos is not explicitly illegal. FDA approval is only required if you are generating a product. An embryo that you intend to implant into a human being is considered a product. But, theoretically, if a private company wanted to create an army of drones completely dedicated to their jobs, biologically wired to work extra hours without pay, there is only one legal barrier standing in their way: the actual implantation step. Of course, this would never happen due to the immense respect and care that private companies have for the natural order of our world. On June 2nd, Brian Armstrong, the billionaire CEO of Coinbase, a cryptocurrency exchange, announced that he believes the time is right for the defining company in the US to be built in the field of gene-edited embryos. Naturally, being the CEO of Coinbase, Brian brings a wealth of experience in complex chemical biology. No, but he is an expert in user privacy and security, battling governmental overreach, and making consumer satisfaction his number one priority. I'm not sure about you, but I have a hard time believing Brian when he claims that this project is about helping people. Late last year, he expressed his interest in this field on Twitter, posting an open invite to a sort of taboo tech soiree with business partner Blake Byers. They invited entrepreneurs with experience in a range of controversial fields of research, including artificial wombs, next-gen IVF, and embryo editing. One thing to note is that Brian has stated his intention to use this startup to fill a gap in the medical field. Now, genetic diseases are what immediately comes to mind when thinking of gene editing, but they can largely already be prevented with prenatal screening. So preventing genetic disease doesn't really represent a gap in research. However, giving resistance to some diseases might represent a gap. It's far more likely that this is what he's referring to. And it also represents a serious ethical issue. Decreasing the chance of a person developing a disease rather than preventing it is widely accepted by scientists to be a genetic enhancement. In other words, it's an improvement that could be applied to the entire human race. Anyone could develop Alzheimer's, so anyone would benefit from increased resistance to Alzheimer's. This means that everyone who received this kind of treatment would essentially be getting an upgrade over other human beings. And this is a dangerous frontier in science, because once someone is selling genetic enhancements, we encounter all of the problems I discussed earlier. Life becomes pay to win, inequality is exacerbated, and before we know it, we're all swimming into the ocean and not saving anything for the trip back. And the timing could not be better, as less than 10 days prior to Brian's announcement, 3 of the leading organizations in the field of gene therapy, representing scientists, service providers, academic centers, biotech orgs, and patients, called for a 10-year global moratorium on heritable human genome editing, which is exactly what Brian is looking to do. They believe the risk of eugenic beliefs rising as a result of commercially available enhancements is too high, and we need more time to properly consider the risks and benefits of heritable gene editing tech. I should note that there are individuals in the field who don't agree with this perspective. Lucas Harrington is a gene editing scientist, and he says that heritable gene editing technology is inevitable, and moratoriums can't stop it from being developed, they can only push it to the shadows. And I get the concern, but I don't see how a billionaire crypto CEO can possibly be the answer. This is an ultra-rich investor with a track record of shady business who wants to make genetically modified embryos a product that he can sell to the highest bidder. I know that sounds harsh, but I can't help but feel that Brian Armstrong is just another tech optimist with a wallet full of hubris. So the answers to my earlier questions are, this is extremely real, and it is happening right now. I can only hope that the team he is planning to assemble has at least some understanding of the consequences of their actions. After all, it only takes one rogue scientist to irreversibly change the world, for better or for worse. What the? In 2018, a Chinese scientist by the name of Jiankui announced to the world that he used CRISPR to edit the genes of 2 embryos which were then implanted and born as twins, Lulu and Nana. He claimed that he did it for the benefit of the children as their father was HIV positive and he wanted to make sure that the kids wouldn't carry the disease. Side note, there are many ways to do this without editing the genes of an embryo. He disabled the CCR5 gene in the children, which is the gene that HIV uses to enter our cells, so it essentially prevented the virus from infecting any of their cells. Naturally, this sparked enormous outrage in the scientific community. At the time, gene editing was in its infancy, with embryo and reproduction experiments pretty much banned across the entire world. Yet, Jiankui faked part of his approval documents and conducted the experiments in secret anyway. Worse, the parents claimed they didn't fully understand what he was doing. Worse still, his science was bad. One of the girls ended up with a different genetic modification than the one that he was trying to give her, which means he didn't even administer the treatment properly, and literally anything could have happened. And his punishment for ignoring international scientific norms and global laws and crossing a boundary that scientists at the time near unanimously agreed nobody should ever cross? 3 years jail. He's been out for years. He posts memes on Twitter now. What the heck, man? I mean, if there's money to be made, people like this will always surface. And unfortunately, there's a lot of money to be made in the field of gene editing. So how do we as a society handle this problem? Obviously, CRISPR, Cas, and other similar techniques have massive potential to help humanity. But gene editing is a really dangerous tool, and deciding what we're okay with is extremely complex. Rosemary Garland Thompson is a bioethicist who has written a lot about this topic. She believes that even attempting to define traits as good or bad is the foundation of eugenics and is inherently incorrect. I think she puts it quite nicely. Human beings cannot simply be improved by wiping away specific characteristics deemed disadvantages from whole human beings embedded in lives and worlds. There is just too much complexity and too much difference from person to person to try and define a single trait as good or bad. As humans, there is beauty in our differences. Now, I'm not saying that we should stop trying to cure any genetic disease and stop trying to help people using this technology. I just think that it's something we need to be really careful about. If we can't decide whether a trait is good or bad, should we really be trying to change it? Time will tell.